What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today to bring you kind of a fun exercise. Basically, what I'm going to be doing today is talking about 10 players and basically saying trust or bust. Am I going to be trusting them in the fantasy playoffs? They're going to be targets of mine to put into my lineup, or am I going to be avoiding them in the fantasy playoffs? Maybe I'm going to be sitting them if I have them on my team or just dropping them altogether. These are going to be some guys that have some buzz around them right now or who have been either performing positively or negatively in the last couple of weeks. So they're very buzzy names heading into the fantasy playoffs. Shout out to Price33 Bear in the Discord for suggesting this idea. I really liked it. And if you guys want an opportunity to suggest video ideas, go ahead and do it in the comment section down below, or you can join the Discord by becoming a Patreon as well, or you can become a member and we'll talk about that kind of stuff when we shout out community polls and stuff like that. So I'm going to start with the big name players and kind of go a little bit deeper as we go along. Like I said, 10 guys, 5 players to target, 5 trusts, or 5 players to avoid, 5 busts for the fantasy football playoffs. Like, comment, subscribe if you enjoy. Now let's hit the intro. All right, we're starting with a heavy hitter. We're starting with a guy who's been very, very fantasy relevant, probably won a number of you guys fantasy championships in years past, and it's Ezekiel Elliott. And this one's really tough for me. For one, you probably drafted Ezekiel Elliott early. So if you did make it to the fantasy playoffs, and in my league, the guy who drafted Ezekiel Elliott is actually the other guy that has a bye. So I have a bye week and he has a bye week, and he drafted Ezekiel Elliott inside the top 8 picks overall. And him being RB15 right now in half PPR points per game is probably not what you wanted when you drafted Ezekiel Elliott. You probably thought you were getting a locked and loaded top 6, top 8 running back at minimum with the type of role that he had in the offense that he plays in. But the concern with Ezekiel Elliott is he's kind of wearing down as the season goes along. It's the reason I had Jonathan Taylor, Antonio Gibson, Austin Eckler, Cam Akers when he was healthy ranked ahead of Ezekiel Elliott. It's because when you get to that 1,500 to 2,000 career touch mark, it is very sketchy to maintain efficiency over the course of a grueling season at a position like running back. And many have fallen off before Zeke at this point in time. So this isn't really a dynasty take right now, but if you can sell Zeke, I would. Zeke Elliott is kind of going in the ways of DeMarco Murray and Todd Gurley and LaShawn McCoy, in my opinion right now. And it's played out in his play. As you guys can see, his PFF grades over the course of the season have diminished. He had a big stretch between weeks 2 and weeks 5 where he was very productive. He looked like the old Zeke Elliott. And as the season has gone along, he's kind of been dealing with some injuries. Apparently, he's dealing with a knee injury, and his play has deteriorated as the season has gone along. Now, a lot of you guys might be like, "Oh, well, he's injured right now. How can you hold that against him?" Well, my problem is that I don't think he's going to get healthy anytime soon, and you guys probably need him for the fantasy football playoffs. His play has declined as the season has went along. That is a fact. He has the New York Giants this week, which is a good matchup for him, but he has Washington and Arizona during the money weeks of the fantasy playoffs, week 16 and week 17. If you have a guy like Elijah Mitchell, if you have a Josh Jacobs, Javonte Williams, guys that are in that kind of tier of like RB2s, I would probably be starting them over Ezekiel Elliott right now, unless something changes, unless I see him play better, unless Tony Pollard continues to be out. Whatever the case is, I'm not trusting Zeke heading into the fantasy playoffs if I can help it. If you have no other choice and you have to put him into your lineup, I don't mind it. But if you can afford to, I would not be starting Zeke in the fantasy playoffs if I can help it. So let's move on to the next guy. That is DK Metcalf, a guy that I am trusting. So I'm going to go one bust, one trust, kind of back and forth as I go through these. But with DK Metcalf, it has been extremely frustrating if you have him. I understand that. But if you're wondering, should you sit this guy in favor of some guys that are performing better than him? Brandon Aiyuk, Van Jefferson, guys that are like fringe wide receiver 2-3 types that are performing well for fantasy right now. Should they be in your lineup this week instead of a guy like DK Metcalf? Absolutely not. This guy is a game breaker, and you're going to feel like a clown if you sit him because we know what DK Metcalf brings to the table. We've seen it in years past. He has the game-breaking, league-winning type of upside on any given week, and if you have that on your bench, you're going to hate yourself, basically. 4 of his last 5 games, he has 8+ targets. The usage is still there for him. He's still getting the targets, and this week he would have had another solid outing if he had caught that touchdown that was basically called back on a holding penalty. He caught a touchdown in the end zone, called back on a penalty, so it didn't end up counting. But if he catches that and it counts in the score on the scoreboard, basically, he would have had a much better game than he did this week. He has Jalen Ramsey in the first round of the fantasy playoffs in week 15, but maybe you have a bye week, or maybe Jalen Ramsey is out again because he is on the COVID list. He was out last night on Monday because of dealing with the COVID list. So if he tested positive and he's unvaccinated or something like that, then maybe he'll be out again next week. But regardless, if you can make it through with DK Metcalf in week 15, he has Chicago and Detroit the final 2 weeks. So this is a guy that I'm absolutely willing to go back to the well on. I'm absolutely willing to trust as we get into the fantasy football playoffs. Now, moving on to a guy that is not in my trust category, he is in my bust category, and that's Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And Clyde has definitely had some good games here and there. I'm not, saying that he's a terrible fantasy running back or something, but his usage is very volatile, and that makes it very hard to trust Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So let's take last week for an example. This past week, he played the Raiders. The Chiefs ran it all over the Raiders. Basically, they had 2 rushing touchdowns out of Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Derek Gore scored a rushing touchdown, and Darrell Williams scored a rushing touchdown. But the problem is, as you guys can see on the screen, this past week, Clyde Edwards-Helaire played 66 snaps, which is just over 30%. He also only saw 13 opportunities, 10 carries, and 3 targets in a favorable game script where they were winning by a decent margin. So with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, this isn't a new trend too. You guys can see coming off of injury the 2 weeks prior, this is a guy that hovers around the 50% snap range. He only gets about 10 to 15 carries a game if he's lucky, and then gets maybe a target or 2 here and there. But outside of that, he doesn't get a whole lot of valuable work. He doesn't usually get inside the 5 work. Typically, he also cedes long down and distance and 2-minute drill snaps to Darrell Williams. So what you're getting basically is a guy that is a part-time player in a great offense, but isn't going to create a whole lot on his own. He's going to need touchdown opportunities and touchdown potential in order to be good for fantasy, and counting solely on touchdowns, which is what I think you're going to have to do with Clyde in the fantasy playoffs, is a losing recipe. So if you have better options, like I said, if you have Elijah Mitchell, if you have Josh Jacobs, if you have somebody that has a more reliable role, then I would much prefer a guy like that heading into the fantasy playoffs than Kansas City's Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So speaking of Josh Jacobs, he is a guy that I'm willing to trust heading into the fantasy playoffs. And you've been burned probably by Josh Jacobs in the past. Probably the reason that many of you guys that drafted Josh Jacobs probably aren't in position to be in the fantasy playoffs right now. But let's say you have Josh Jacobs on your roster. Maybe he was dropped when he was injured. Maybe you traded for him low. Whatever the case is, he's been the hero that none of us expected him to be in recent weeks. And basically what I'm talking about, as you guys can see on the screen, he played about 66% of the snaps in week 11 and week 12. And then Kenyon Drake got hurt in week 13, and he was upgraded to like an 85% snap share running back. 93% of the carries, 80% of the routes. He was actually getting long down and distance and 2-minute drill work for the first time really in his entire career, because Josh Jacobs' primary value before Kenyon Drake got injured was typically you needed this guy to get 15 to 20 carries. He'd probably have to score a touchdown, 2 to have a huge week. But now he's starting to get some receiving work. He had 9 targets, 4 targets, and 6 targets in the past 3 games. And even with what I would consider to be a death sentence game script for Josh Jacobs this past week against Kansas City, they lost like 48-9. They got destroyed. This is a death sentence game script for a guy like Josh Jacobs, who before was a guy that needed good game scripts in order to be fantasy relevant. He still played 75% of the snaps, ran 61% of the team's routes, 30 of the 42 among running back, and saw another 6 targets this week. So with Josh Jacobs' recent change in usage, I'm kind of likening him a little bit closer to David Montgomery now, as opposed to like the Miles Sanders range of usage that we'd been seeing from him before. Now he doesn't have the easiest schedule down the stretch. He has the Browns, the Broncos, and the Colts that don't give up a huge amount to the run. But what those guys are is they're not Kansas City. They're not going to hang 45 points on the Las Vegas Raiders and blow them out. Those teams are probably going to invite a lot of close games with the way they play offense, the Browns, the Colts, and the Broncos. So what I'm thinking with Josh Jacobs is that you're going to get this solidified 15-plus carry role, couple targets here and there, long down and distance, 2-minute drill, and inside the 5 work. And this is a guy that a lot of people probably cast aside at some point in the season, and you might have as like your 3rd or 4th running back. Maybe you can sit Ezekiel Elliott in favor of a guy like Josh Jacobs. He is a guy that I am trusting to help lead me to fantasy glory coming into the fantasy playoffs. A guy that I'm not trusting, though, is Michael Pittman Jr. Now, if you'll recall from the league-winning playoff schedules video, Michael Pittman Jr. has the most difficult schedule in the entire wide receiver range, basically. And the reason is because, as you guys can see on the screen, he has the New England Patriots this week, which should see him in a lot of coverage against J.C. Jackson as the number 1 receiver on that team. J.C. Jackson has been a lockdown corner this year. I don't expect Michael Pittman to have a great game. And of course, the Bill Belichick tendency is to take away your best weapon. And if they're able to successfully limit Jonathan Taylor, then this offense probably won't score a whole lot of points in general. The week after, he has Arizona, who's pretty good against the run as well. Stymied Sony Michel last night. And then the Las Vegas Raiders, who are good against the pass, especially. And Casey Hayward has been shadow covering receivers this year as well, and has done a pretty good job in shadow coverage. So with Michael Pittman Jr., on top of the fact that you have a team that is not going to run a high-paced offense, they're running the single slowest pace offense in the NFL, 33.57 time per snap in neutral situations. They are the slowest offense in the NFL, which is going to basically result in less offensive plays, which means less targets, less routes for Michael Pittman Jr. The Colts are also running at the third highest rate in the NFL in neutral game scripts since week 9. So this is a team that loves to run the ball. And when they do run the ball, they need to do it successfully in order to put up a lot of points. And that might come to an end, not come to an end, because obviously Jonathan Taylor's having a great season, but that might be limited to the extent that we saw it earlier in the season, because when they were playing the Texans and the Jets and some of these teams, it's very, very easy to run on those teams. These defenses coming up are good teams. They're good defenses, especially against the run and pass. So what we're looking for with Michael Pittman Jr. is a guy that needs to get elite target volume in order to be efficient. I just don't think that he is a lock for your starting lineup. If you have better options, I could foresee him disappointing fantasy managers down the stretch. So if you wanted to play guys like Brandon Aiyuk, guys like Odell Beckham Jr., who might be like fringe wide receiver 3 types in your lineup, basically, instead of a guy like Michael Pittman Jr., I don't think that's a terrible idea, especially this week against the New England Patriots, when it's, a must-win week for a lot of you, because if you don't win this week, you're not going to advance. I would much prefer guys like Brandon Aiyuk. And speaking of Brandon Aiyuk, we're going to pivot right into him. And he is a guy that I am trusting heading into the fantasy playoffs right now. 4 straight games where Brandon Aiyuk has ran more routes than Deebo Samuel. Now, let me repeat that. He's ran more routes than Deebo Samuel in 4 straight games. Now, I know Deebo Samuel is used out of the backfield and used as like a gadget guy, but what we wanted coming into the season, what I saw in Brandon Aiyuk, which made me so high on him, was this guy was going to be the X receiver. Deebo Samuel was going to be the gadget guy running some routes, also contributing as a running back out of the backfield. And then George Kittle is obviously going to do George Kittle things. His target share over the last 4 games, Brandon Aiyuk, is 35%, 23%, 21%, and 30%. That is exactly what I wanted to see dating back to week 1. What we're seeing out of Aiyuk is what we expected from the beginning of the season. Deebo Samuel would be the gadget option. Aiyuk would assume the number 1 role. Now, does that mean that Deebo Samuel is less valuable down the stretch than Brandon Aiyuk? No, of course not. I would prefer Deebo Samuel in fantasy to Brandon Aiyuk, but I think with Aiyuk, his role is a lot safer now. The Falcons, Titans, and Texans are the final 3 games for Brandon Aiyuk and for Deebo Samuel heading down the stretch. So I am comfortable trusting Brandon Aiyuk as a wide receiver 2 the rest of the season, with the target share he's getting, with how he's performing on the field, with the way this 49ers offense is actually throwing a little bit more than what we anticipated. I'm ready to be hurt again, basically, with Brandon Aiyuk. I think he is going to be a lot better than what he had been previously during this season. So let's move on to Antonio Brown, a guy that has a lot of question marks around him right now. Of course, many who have Antonio Brown are probably eagerly waiting his return right now. Maybe you're already in the playoffs. You have a bye week and you're like, holy shit, let me just get to week 16 when Antonio Brown isn't suspended anymore, because this was a guy that was the wide receiver 7 in half PPR points per game before he got injured against the Eagles in week 6. And then of course, suspended again. So assuming Antonio Brown isn't cut, and this comes from a Bucs fan, so I know how my team and my franchise operates, assuming he isn't cut before the suspension, because that could still happen according to Ian Rappaport and Adam Schefter, his suspension is over in week 16. The earliest you can use him is next week. So you have to make it through this week of playoffs before you can use Antonio Brown. I doubt Bruce Arians is going to insert him into the role that he had before. And the reason is because Bruce Arians preaches accountability at every turn. He sticks to his values. And what Antonio Brown did was obviously to the detriment of the team. And it definitely endangered the team, gave him some negative PR. And in his absence, Rashaad Penny and Tyler Johnson have stepped up. So the risk with Antonio Brown is that when he gets back into the lineup in week 16, coming off of suspension, 1, he's coming off of an injury as well. So is he going to be out there the 65, 70% of the routes that he was before, which is even a low number still? But the maximum amount of time you'll have to see for Antonio Brown is going to rely on, do they trust this guy to be in the lineup going forward? And I tend to think that Bruce Arians is going to punish him to some degree with his playing time. He probably won't be out there 65, 70, 80% of the time like he was before. I'm expecting him probably to be a role player going forward, if he's even on the team altogether. So Antonio Brown, come week 16, if he's still a Tampa Bay Buccaneer and you have a decision, Brandon Aiyuk versus Antonio Brown in your start sit, your flex spot or whatever, I am going to shy away from Antonio Brown until I see confirmation that he is back on the field. The coaching staff is willing to give him his old role back and he's able to produce at the level that we saw beforehand. Now, could he be back in week 17 if he produces in week 16 and you could throw him back into your lineup at that point? Sure. but I'm anticipating that they will kind of punish him to some degree and not give him a huge role to close out the season. So let's move on to Rashaad Penny. I'll speed through these last couple, of course. This one could be a fool me once type of situation, but I'm buying into Rashaad Penny's resurgence down the stretch. Now, the reason is because I think there is a role that can be carved out for him. We've seen Chris Carson be valuable in this offense as like a mid RB2. And no, I'm not going to be sitting, better options for a guy like Rashaad Penny because I don't think his role is, already locked into the Chris Carson role. But I do think he can at least be a viable flex play rest of the season. Obviously, if he's on your waiver wire right now, go out and get him. Go out and drop the last remaining dollars of your fab because he is the number one pickup this week. The Seahawks have been searching for any semblance of a running game this year to the point that they signed Adrian Peterson off the street a couple weeks ago. And Penny provided a spark, and Carroll, I think, will reward him by giving him more playing time. He already has come out and said that he deserves a shot to establish himself as the lead back. Now, of course, he could get injured because he's Rashaad Penny, but saying that they're still going to rotate some backs in here and there to keep running backs fresh. But yeah, we're going to give him a shot again to come right on and see if we can get him going again. Basically, that is like the exact quote that he said. So what I'm thinking is that they're going to give Rashaad Penny about a 57% snap share, which is what he saw last week. They're going to mix in Travis Homer. They're going to mix in Alex Collins here and there. But Rashaad Penny is probably going to lead the team in touches, be in that 15 to 20 touch range. And that's going to make him a viable flex play, especially considering he does have some easier matchups down the stretch. Rams, Bears, and then obviously the Lions in week 17 to close the season out. So am I trusting Rashaad Penny as a back-end RB1? Absolutely not. But what I am trusting Rashaad Penny as is a great waiver wire pickup for you guys right now that you could throw into your flex spot if you need to. If you have DeAndre Swift and he's out for the next couple of weeks and Jamal Williams isn't back off the COVID list or whatever, I would much rather start a guy like Rashaad Penny than any Lions backup or anything like that. So Rashaad Penny, in my case, I don't have to find out to see what his role is going to be this week because I do have a bye week this week. I can let it play out before I have to risk putting him into my lineup. But come week 16, week 17, I think this is a guy that is going to have secured the Chris Carson role in his offense. So let's talk about some quarterbacks to close this one out. And I'm going to start with Taysom Hill. And Taysom Hill was basically the inspiration for this video because the guy who suggested it was like, should we trust Taysom Hill? Let's just start with Taysom Hill is not an NFL quarterback. He's not good enough to play quarterback in the NFL. He's completed 54% of his passes over the 2 games that he started so far, and his PFF passing grade is 47.6 on the season. So this guy is not a good passer. You cannot rely on Taysom Hill to give you any kind of passing production, especially given who he's throwing to right now, because outside of Alvin Kamara, he is throwing to slappies like Traquan Smith and a bunch of other bums out there. This guy has to rush to be productive for fantasy. And of course, rushing is very good for fantasy quarterbacks, and that's why he's been valuable to this point. But here is the issue. Number one, teams know that is all Taysom Hill can do is run. They're going to force him to stay in the pocket and throw the ball. That is how teams are going to game plan against Taysom Hill going forward. And number two, and this is the most important part, he has a brutal schedule of tough run defenses the rest of the season. He has Tampa Bay on the road, and I can tell you they are going to be focused on keeping him inside the pocket and forcing him to throw. He has the Dolphins, who are also much better defense recently than they've been over the course of the season. And they're pretty good against the run, especially. And then he has the Panthers in week 17. So these teams are not the New York Jets, who they played this past week. The New York Jets are an anemic defense. They're not going to be able to do anything against Taysom Hill that he played last week. He is far, far too risky to play over some better options. I know a lot of people are going to be tempted to play him over a guy like Dak Prescott, who Dak Prescott has had some down weeks in recent games, but his range of outcomes is much safer and more reliable than Taysom Hill, even given the rushing production. So a guy like Dak Prescott, do not start Taysom Hill over him during the fantasy playoffs. Taysom Hill has a very tough schedule, and even a guy like Tua Tagovailoa, I would much rather start who's playing much better football, who I can rely on to get production through the air, or even the next guy that I'm about to talk about. And that guy, the final guy of the video, my final trust of the video as well, is Justin Fields. Now, Justin Fields is obviously a semi-risky play, but if you guys are streaming quarterbacks in the playoffs, this guy has to be at the top of your list right now. And as you guys can see right now, Justin Fields has finished as a top 10 quarterback in each of the last 3 games. And not only that, but it's sustainable production. The scramble rates of Taysom Hill, meaning the amount of time that he's scrambling outside of the pocket, picking up yards with his legs, and also scrambling and throwing the ball, is up near 20% per game. And the designed rush attempts are also there as well. He has the Vikings, the Seahawks, and the Giants up next. And those defenses are not going to be, scaring me off of Justin Fields because he's played much better defenses in recent weeks and been able to perform. This is a guy that's getting better as the season goes along. He is a rookie quarterback. And more importantly, back to the Taysom Hill point, this guy actually has weapons to throw to. Now, they're not the greatest weapons in the world, but he has David Montgomery. He has Cole Kmet. He has deep threat receivers like Jakeem Grant and Darnell Mooney and Damiere Byrd and Allen Robinson if he decides to wake up anytime soon. So I'm trusting Justin Fields over Taysom Hill for the duration of the fantasy playoffs if I am streaming quarterbacks. And Taysom Hill, like I said, is not a guy that I'm going to be willingly trusting in the fantasy playoffs. So if you guys did enjoy that video, as always, hit the like button, comment any of your thoughts down below, and subscribe to the channel if you are new. If you guys go to the link in the description right now, you'll see a number of new offerings that we have going right now. You can now get fantasy football consultations in a very organized and quick way. You can go to the Google form that's in the link in the description right now, pay directly on there, and you can basically get a fantasy football sit down on a Zoom call with myself or with Danny or with both of us for $30 for one of us and then $50 for both of us, of course. And then also our weekly rankings are available for free in the description right now. Stay tuned for the running back rankings and the wide receiver rankings to close out this week of content. Peace out, guys, and I'll talk to you soon.